On configuration, when you configure Liferay, then you will see that there are various ways to do the configuration, to configure it. If you're with Liferay for a while, you will definitely know about the infamous portal-ext properties file. That is a file that is around forever. My first point of contact with Liferay was in 2008, and there we've had this file. It was a humongous, large file. Actually, portal-ext properties is small, but the template for it, the basic, is a humongous file, really big. And back then, you know, earlier in times in the ancient past, everything was better. No, it wasn't, because it's relatively cryptic, it's long. Anything that you configure in portal-ext properties requires Liferay to restart. I'll mention that a little bit later as well, but we still have it around and we need it for some configurations. And for others, we have a more comfortable way to configure Liferay, and that is the config files. It says here .config files because .config is the file ending of these files, and the content of these files is standardized, and we can see how to get them. What's the standard for those config files? The standard for those config files is, well, you can configure them through the user interface. You can configure files through the user interface? Really? Well, yes. We have some settings, actually quite a lot of settings, that you find in the control panel, in the system settings or instance settings, that display a couple of these little icons that you see on the slide. If you can't recognize them just because of the screen resolution, just go to control panel and system settings or instance settings and take a look at them. This is a full-blown user interface for all of these settings, and you can click in there and modify these settings. System settings for just all of the current platform, and instance settings for just this very one specific instance. We didn't cover it yet, but you can run multiple instances on the same server that have nothing to do with each other. We'll cover that a little bit later, but so far just know that there's a basic system valid for everything, and then there's individual parts, individual instances that you can also configure. Speaking about the config files configurable through the user interface, as soon as you have configured these settings through the user interface, you are able to export these settings as files. And once you have these files, you can carry them around to every other system that you're running, which is the best way to actually create these files, because the file names will be long, the file names are meaningful, they will tell Liferay what you want to configure with them, and then the contents need to be according to exactly the file name, which means it's easiest to just go through the user interface, use the form fields that you see there, export the configuration file, and then carry on and maybe edit it in an editor. But creating the config files from scratch requires a lot of work. Creating them on this user interface is trivial. Now, the other alternative is if you update through properties files. Ancient technique, yes, we have standard properties files, and it says here the read order of properties files is portal properties, portal-ext properties, and portal setup wizard properties. What does that mean? Well, portal properties is a file that Liferay contains deep in its own implementation. You typically can't see it unless you really search for it. You unzip a jar file, and then you will find the very, very, very long portal properties. This is a file that contains various default settings that you can override. And it says here the read order of these files is we first read Liferay's own variant, and then we read portal-ext properties. Portal-ext properties is a file that you write on your own. And the typical portal-ext properties file is not humongous, but it has somewhere between 5 and, let's say, 50 lines. There are longer ones, there are shorter ones, but they only contain your variations, everything that varies in your installation towards the default portal properties files. And then there's Portal Setup Wizard properties. This is a file that Liferay's Setup Wizard writes, and this is the only time that Liferay DXP will ever write to a properties file or to one of these properties files. They are meant for you to modify, and only the Setup Wizard once writes Portal Setup Wizard properties. If you run Setup Wizard, our Docker image is configured so that we don't run the Setup Wizard, which means for you, it's never written anyways. How do you know what to configure, what to add to Portal properties, what to write into Portal Ext properties? Well, it's easy. You go to Portal properties, you'll find all of the settings that we provide. There's also documentation in these files, and then you can copy these settings and paste them into your own Portal Ext properties, and you'll see this, our template provides you with everything you need to know about the values, the reasons, what you can configure in Portal Ext properties. And then it says here, avoid editing Portal properties directly at all cost. That means we embed it deep in Liferay in one of the jar files in Liferay for a reason. You're not supposed to edit it ever. You don't need to, because you can just configure, you can just edit Portal Ext properties, and that's just as good. Talking about configuration, we have a couple of default data in Liferay. For example, when you just install Liferay, you'll have some sample data in there, for example, some dynamic data lists, you have some document types there, you have web content templates, and well, it says here application display templates. They've recently been renamed to widget templates, I believe is the new name. Well, think of application display templates as the name until 7.1. Widget templates is what you'll find in 7.2. This is some data that every single Liferay instance has, and that just is, I get the signal, yes, it's actually widget templates. That's good. So these are templates that determine the look and feel of various components in Liferay. These are free marker templates typically, which you can change, but they'll always be there. There's typically not much use of changing them up front, but you can migrate them from one system to another, but that's not part of this. This is rather part of our content management courses, because this is now application level code. This is not the configuration of the behavior of the system, this is actually the look and feel. So if you wonder in DevOps about widget templates, don't worry anymore. That's our content side, that's what the authors take care of, that's not the system level configuration. You can have various configurations on the locale side. We have variation, or we can configure instance-wide locales. Locales is typically language together with a language setting. For example, American dates are always month, day, year. I personally can't live with that. I need to stop reading, parse the date, and then continue reading, and then having forgotten the first part of the sentence. So the American locale, even though I understand English, doesn't make much sense to me, because suddenly there's a date that I can't parse. Now that's my personal problem, because any of the Americans won't be able to parse the British locale, which is also English, but uses day, month, year. And that will be the problem of all the Americans who can't parse that. But that's part of the locale. It might be the language, it might be just the format of the dates of the time, 24 hours versus 12 hours of time zones or of times. We can have them instance-wide, which means a full instance, the default locale would be, let's say, English US, which is Liferay's default. We can have it site-wide. If we run an intranet and we have an intranet site for the German branch of our company, we could say, the default locale for the German branch is German. And then we can have individual user settings. So even though somebody might work in the German branch, they might not understand German, or they might still want to have their American date format, then they still can override these settings and say, well, even though this site used to be German, I prefer to have them in English US, or I prefer to have them in French. And all the content that is available in multiple languages will be shown to them in the appropriate language. Now, skipping over to the content side, in order to update any of the content, or in order to show any of the content in the locale that you have selected, it's got to be available in the locale that you have selected. So if I write an article in German and I don't write it in English, there's no way Liferay can show it in English to anyone, or in French, or in Spanish, or in Chinese. And it says here, user settings take precedence over site settings take precedence over instance settings. And in the instance settings, you can say, we support these 4 languages, or 6 or 20 languages. This is just what is available to choose from within your whole instance, and then within the site you can choose, and as a user you can choose as well. Now that I've talked a lot about configuring settings in Liferay, let's go into the details and let's have some exercise. Let's, well, try them out. Especially the last ones. We'll configure the default language for the platform. We'll configure the default time zone for the platform. And then we're going to use one of the old trusty tools, Telnet, to just peek into the OSGI runtime, which is not quite a configuration, but we'll see later on where this is, what this is good for. These upcoming exercises will now explain a little bit more about the underlying platform and give me an opportunity to talk about best practices. Again, as we said, the default languages, well, there's no best practice for language. If you choose, you'll have English available. It might be your default. If you choose, English is not even an option for our platform because we want our local language, that's fine as well. That's totally fine. On the time zone though, we're in DevOps here. According to me, the best practice for DevOps is use UTC, stop there. No need to worry about anything else. Now that's the technical level. And if anybody in your organization protests because they happen to be on in a different time zone by default, then you should still stand by the decision the server runs on UTC. On the content side, or on the Liferay configuration side, you can say the default time zone for anybody signing up shall be American East Coast, shall be Chinese time zone, shall be Sydney, Australia, whatsoever. But technically, all of the timestamps will be stored as UTC. And then only for display, they will get changed to the local time zone that you determine as your default time zone. And then, of course, every user can set their own time zone. Even though my intranet runs in Sydney, if I'm in Germany, I don't care about the Sydney local time because that always takes a while for me to process. I want to know what's the local time for me. You can see that on liferay.dev, which is a community site. If you go to the forums there and it says, there's a forum post that will happen 3 hours in the future. Now that's a weird setting, but that's most likely a different time zone than your own local time zone. You can log in, set your own local time zone, and you will get presented with the time in exactly your time zone that you have selected. And that's due to the setup of that server, where we store the standard time zones in UTC, or the standard timestamps in UTC, and then from there on we'll calculate the correct one to show on the user interface. So DevOps, use UTC, instance configuration, whatever makes sense. Now, going into the exercises, you'll find the exercises written, but what are you doing here? We'll start the container for the Tomcat service, and here we're going to just go into the instance settings, set a new default language for the platform. You can easily find that, and it's well laid out in the exercises. Set a new language, verify that the new language change has been in effect by using a new browser that has a new session there, and then you can revert to the original default language. And there you can also try to download a config file. With a time zone, exactly the same thing. Set a custom time zone for the platform and check it. And you can also change the time zone on the site level. Now, if you are really only in DevOps and you have no experience with Liferay in the user interface whatsoever, this might be a little bit too much because you haven't seen what you can do in Liferay. You haven't seen what happens, like why would I want to have different sites on my one platform? And we don't really go too deep into the content side here. How can I set up a proper website with Liferay or proper websites with Liferay in plural? That's always hard to do, but well, you'll find the exercise here. If you really have no experience with Liferay, go through the exercise and do whatever is asked from you. Otherwise, you might get somebody else to your side and say, hey, can you help me with this exercise and explain what's happening here? Because that's by far outside of the scope of a DevOps training to explain what all of the different sites are. That's firmly on the content side. And then on the configuration or on the application component management, we'll have a little exercise where we telnet into the running container, into the running Liferay, and we can deactivate a module on the app manager in the user interface. We can restart it through telnet. And if you have wondered, in the Docker files, it's the Docker compose file, there's a port mapping for port 11311. That's exactly what we're going to use here, because that's a port that goes deep into the OSGI runtime where we can telnet into and start modules, stop modules, exchange modules, which typically sends a shiver through the spine of any system administrator. But we're opening that port here for you to demonstrate and to go into the system, to know what's happening here, to know that it's there. You can undeploy that component. You can even stop this shell component and it will be gone. Well, with that knowledge that this component is here, you can use it for maintenance. You got to protect it to not be available from the internet, definitely. But knowing that the component is there will help you, or will help developers debug and understand what's happening if something goes wrong. So that's the reason why we have this exercise here. And if you use it, if you make it available in your system or not, that's up to you. Best practice, of course, for a hardened system is no surface, have nothing on the surface whatsoever. Shut it down, that's fine. But still, it's a component that's there until you happen to undeploy it. That's your task for the exercises. And then there's a bonus exercise as well, where we go through Portal Ext properties and we give you some hint on where you can find the 7.2 Portal properties files. This brings me to a long-standing homework task that I like to give everyone. Portal properties, the original file that you must not change, has thousands of lines. And if you look at the original file, it has I would say 70–80% of these lines, if not more, are comments. And then the remaining part are actual settings or empty lines. So these thousands of lines are well worth a read. Not because you want to learn what you can configure, but because you want to have seen it at least once, because you will learn what can be configured. You'll have a feeling of, oh, I have seen that somewhere. Where was it? Oh, it was that Portal properties file. And as soon as you have an idea that this can be configured, you will know that you don't need to develop your own custom component, but you might be able to just tweak a switch, configure a setting, and get what you want. So quite often there is no need to develop your own custom code and deploy it to Liferay, but just to tweak some configuration settings. And when you read Portal properties, yes, it's a boring and an interesting read at the same time. You can skip over certain sections, no problem. But then there's other sections that will ring a bell for you, that will teach you something that is configurable. So warm recommendation, read Portal properties. Don't print it and take it to bed, because you will, unless you have problems falling asleep. But read it, go through it, browse through it. It's really worth it. And there you'll have some settings that can be changed. And remember, we're building Portal Ext properties into our image, which means anytime you want to change Portal X properties, you've got to build a new image. And another side effect of changing in Portal properties or Portal X properties is anytime you want that change to be picked up, you must restart the server, which is actually the reason why more and more configuration goes out of Portal properties into the config files, into the OSGI configuration, into the user interface that we have seen in the beginning, because they can be hot deployed and they will be active as soon as they are there. So you can keep your system running. They will even be distributed within the cluster. And that's exactly what we want. We don't want to restart just because we've tweaked a little setting. So more and more is going into the actual configs. Less and less is being read from Portal X properties. But it's still worth reading it to know what can be configured. That's the exercise introduction, which means I got to give you some time. Ready, set, go.